Hello everyone and welcome back to the channel. In this video I'll be walking you through the process for how I painted the Black Armour on this Horus Heresy Space Marine. Just to be upfront with everyone, this video is only going to be focused on the Black Armour itself, so I won't be going over every aspect of the model like the yellow, the metallics and things like that. If you do want to see how I paint the yellow on this model, I do plan on doing an Imperial Fist tutorial in the near future, so be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss that. And also, if you want to know how I did the metallics on this model, very similar to how I did them in my previous video, which was the Night Lords tutorial, so be sure to go back and watch that one. It's a very similar process, so I didn't see the point in repeating it in this video. As always, if you find the video useful, please give it a thumbs up, and if you have any comments or questions, leave them down below and I'll get back to you. So let's get into it. So to begin with, I've primed the model black, and then we're going to be using some Doomfire Magenta contrast. You could use a magenta ink if you want to, and this is a slightly different way of painting black to what you might be used to, and I'll explain that in more detail in a moment. But what we're going to do with this paint is we're going to spray it from underneath so that it goes into all of the shadows. I'm then going to use some green blue shade ink, and we're going to be spraying this from above, so opposite to what we just did with the magenta. So we're going to spray this onto all of the upper areas, and also you want this to overlap slightly with the magenta, so kind of in the mid-range of the model you want the magenta and the turquoise to overlap with each other. This may seem like an odd choice for painting black armour, and as I said, this is an experiment for myself that I decided to film. But when you look at the colour wheel, if you take two colours that are opposite each other, or very close to being opposite each other, when they meet in the middle, you do get a shade of almost black, which I think is a bit more interesting than just using a flat black paint. I think it just looks a little bit more interesting on the model. It's very subtle. You do have to look quite closely to be able to tell, but just makes it, I think, look a little bit more interesting than just using a standard black paint. I'm then going to revert to a more traditional kind of pre-shade, but I'm going to be very careful with this. I'm going to be using some grey ink, and I'm not going to do a full zenithal kind of pre-shade like we quite often do, but I'm just going to hit the areas where the light would catch the most, so kind of almost like the little bubbles of light that you see reflecting off of black material and that sort of thing. So I'm going to hit kind of like the top of the chest, the tops of the legs, the areas of the armor that are kind of exposed to the light. I'm then going to do the same again, but with this time with white ink, and I'm just going to be really careful just to hit those same areas that we did with the grey, but kind of not covering all of the grey, so an even smaller area than before, just to get those pockets of light that would be reflecting off of the armour. I make a bit of a mistake here by placing some white kind of on the underside of the front of the leg where it shouldn't be, so but I'm not too worried. We'll come back and fix that in just a moment. So starting to take shape, but those bright areas are far too bright at the moment, so the next stage we'll tone this down a bit, and we're going to be using some Black Templar contrast, and I'm spraying this neat through the airbrush. To be honest, this was a little bit of a mistake. If I was to do this again, I would probably thin it, probably 2 parts thinner to 1 part paint, and do a couple of thin coats. So it still worked the way that I did it here, but I think it would have looked nicer if I was to have built up a couple of thin coats rather than just doing a thick coat to start off with. But the aim of this is just to tone down those really bright areas. And the other good thing is that this particular paint, the Black Templar paint, has a slight greenish tone to it. So when you spray it over that red, it's going to neutralize it, like we spoke about earlier with the color wheel. So yeah, that red that we've sprayed is going to be hardly noticeable. You will still notice it a little bit, but I think it just adds some interest to a color that's not usually very interesting. So yeah, that's what I'm going for anyway. So yeah, as you can see, this is what it looks like when we've finished the airbrushing. I think it looks a lot more interesting than just using a black paint with some grey and white highlights. It's very, very subtle. You have to look really closely to kind of see the red and the green, but I think it gives quite a nice effect. Just included some shots here just under some different lights, just so you can see how it looks under different lighting. But yeah, I think it's a good base for us to work with. We're now going to move on to some brush work, and I'll show you what paints we're using here. So these are the paints that we'll be using for our highlights and our edge highlights. So ironically, the first one is Sons of Horus Green, and I'm going to be using pastel green from Scale 75 Artist, green grey from Vallejo, and then some white. I did do a little bit of practice off camera before filming this, just to make sure that the idea that I had worked. As you can see on the bottom of the leg there, that's the effect that we're going to be going for. So in the next steps, I'll walk you through how I did that. So to begin with, I'm going to take the Sons of Horus Green, and I'm basically going to edge highlight all of the armor panels, all of the edges with this color, and this is going to form the base for the highlights, the further highlights that we're going to add in just a moment. Next, I'm just using some of the pastel green from Scale 75 Artist. I'm just going to be placing this over the most prominent edges in an overlapping manner with the previous highlight. Not trying to cover the whole of the previous line, but just do a smaller part of the edge. So for example, on the top of the knee pad, I'm just doing the very upper edge. I'm not going all the way around. I'm just doing the top section of it, just so that some of that previous color is still showing through. Once we've done that, I'm going to take some of the green grey from Vallejo and I'm going to do the same thing but on a much smaller area. So the same lines that you just painted with the pastel green, but repeat the process, but just do it over a smaller area, just being more and more careful each time we move on to a new paint. And what you'll find with this style of painting is the further you get into it, the steps get quicker and quicker. So that first initial edge highlight where we highlighted everything, that took the longest. Then the next one's a little bit quicker and the next one's a little bit quicker after that, because we're covering a smaller area each time. As you can probably tell with this sort of highlighting, I'm not going to show every single brush stroke on the video because we'll be here for quite a while and I think people would just get bored. But I'll show as much as I can while still keeping the video within a reasonable length. This is where we are at the moment, and we're just going to move on to some pure white next, and we're going to be just hitting the very almost like the corners of the armor. So if you imagine like a black piece of metal or a black piece of plastic, where the light reflects the most, you'll have these tiny white kind of dots on the edges of the armor. So we're not even painting lines here really, we're just doing kind of dots on the corners of the edges of the armor. So once we've done that, the reflections on pretty much all of the edges of the armor are almost, well, they're pretty much finished, to be honest. What we're going to do in the next step is we're going to try and push it a little bit further by just adding some reflections to some of the flatter panels. So not all of them, but just on some of the ones that are kind of like the most prominent. So you'll see on like the outside of the legs that are most exposed to the light, we're going to try and do some blending here to kind of just to kind of simulate some reflections there. So I've moved back to using the green grey from Vallejo, and I'm just adding almost like a line, kind of like a line that tapers off at the end, like a really narrow kind of triangle. And then when I'm taking the brush off of the camera here, I'm wetting it and I'm using the water whilst the paint's still wet on the model, just to feather it away, just to blend it into the previous layer, so it's not just a sharp line on the surface. So what I'm doing is I'm just alternating between paint and water and just gradually blending just by feathering it with water on the edge. And the technique I'm trying to use here is to kind of move the brush from the area that you don't want the paint to the area that you do want the paint. So the point that you lift the brush off the model is where most of the paint will accumulate. Just repeat the process until you're happy with the way it's looking. Would recommend letting it dry every now and then because you are using a lot of water using this method, so it can get quite wet on the surface. So I'd recommend letting it dry properly every now and then, just so that you can get a good idea for how it's looking. But just repeat the process until you're happy. And I'm not going to show footage of this on every single armor panel because again we'll be here for too long and the video will just go on for too long. So I'm just mainly going to demonstrate it here on the leg, but the same would apply to any panel that you want to do this on. So whether it's kind of like the upper arms or the tops of the backpack, places like that. I'm now going to go back to the Black Templar contrast and I'm going to use this with some contrast medium. I'm going to thin this probably three parts thinner to 1 part paint so that we get quite a translucent glaze. We're going to use this to go over the areas that we've just been blending on. And this is going to really help to smooth those highlights into the previous black layer that we already had there. You can see the transparency that we're going for on the glove there. So this is, as I said, it's mostly medium, so 3 parts contrast medium, 1 part paint. It's just to give a nice transparent filter which just helps to kind of blend it into the previous colour. And once those glazes are dry, this is what we're left with. I'm fairly happy with it. There's a few bits that aren't perfect, but yeah, reasonably happy. I'm just doing a quick oil wash or a pin wash in the crevices of the armour. I'm going to be quite careful with this because I don't want this to go over all of the blending that we've just spent quite a bit of time doing. I won't talk too much about oil washes here because I've covered that quite a lot in my previous couple of videos. But I'm just going to be careful just to kind of get this exactly where I want it, especially because I haven't varnished the model in this case, which I would recommend doing. Recommend giving it a gloss coat so that if you do make any mistakes they're easier to clean up. I didn't do that here because I was feeling a bit lazy, to be honest. One thing I did do, which it seems I forgot to press record on the camera for, was I did just use a piece of sponge just to add some brown chips to the armour in certain places. So only a very few, and just where those brown chips were added, I'm just going back in with the green grey and just highlighting them just to make them look a little bit more prominent. And that is the final stage. So let me know what you think. Let me know if you give this a try yourself. Like I said, this was just an experiment for my own personal use really, that I just decided to record and see if it turned out okay. I think it did. So there's definitely some things I think I'll tweak. I did, when you see the final images at the end here, I have given the whole model a coat of satin varnish. Probably won't do that in the future, because what that satin does is it adds some very kind of subtle reflections, and because we've painted on reflections, you don't then really want real life reflections on the paint as well. So I'll probably give it a coat of matte varnish instead of the satin. And yeah, I think the only other change that I would make is, yeah, I think I mentioned it before when I was doing the airbrushing, I'd thin the contrast paint instead of just doing a thicker coat. But other than that, I think I'm pretty happy with the process. So yeah, let me know what you think. If you did enjoy the video, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Really appreciate that. One thing I will just mention as a shameless plug is I do currently have some commission spaces available. So if there is anything that you'd like to have painted, I'll leave a link in the description to a form that you can fill out where we can give you a quote. So thanks for watching everyone, and I'll see you on the next one.